Welcome to a special Emerging Civil War live event. I'm Chris Mackowski, editor-in-chief. Delighted to have you with me today. We're going to give folks just a minute or two to get caught up in case they're having a second to get logged in or get settled down at their computer. But I'm pleased to have with us tonight Lisa Samia. Lisa, how are you tonight?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you? Thank you for having me this
Oh,
evening.
absolutely. And I'll give you a right formal introduction here in just a second when we give folks a chance to chime in. But uh, really glad to spend a little time doing something a little different for
Yeah.
ECW and bringing a creative writer on. But you're an award winning poet and have spent a lot of time exploring the Civil War through your writing.
hmm Exactly. Yep.
So, and just to give folks a general idea, what we'll do tonight is after I introduce Lisa, she's going to share some of her poems, talk about some of the inspiration behind her poems. And then at the end, we'll have a brief discussion and you'll have the opportunity to ask questions along the way as well. So, we do have a chat function. If you have questions, feel free to put your questions in the chat. We'll get to them at the end during the Q&A as well. So, well, Lisa, if you're ready, I'll give you that right proper introduction. We'll let you take it. All
Thank
right.
you.
So, Lisa Samia specializes in writing about the American Civil War history with a particular emphasis on giving a voice to the nameless and faceless men who fought in the conflict. She'll share some of her poems and discuss her work with us tonight. You can also see some of her work already on Emerging Civil War. She's done several guest posts for us there, and it was such a neat way of looking at the war and approaching it and discussing it. But that's why I wanted to invite her to be on with us tonight. She's been selected as the National Park Service Artist in Residence at Stones River in Murfreesboro back in 2025. The National Park Service Artist in Residence at Manassas in 2021, and the National Park Service Artist in Residence at Gettysburg in 2020. All of these for poetry. She's written 3 Civil War collections of poetry and essays: The Nameless and Faceless of the Civil War, The Nameless and Faceless Women of the Civil War, and The Nameless and Faceless of the Civil War, Gettysburg, Manassas, and more. She's earned herself her book. That book earned a nomination from the International Edgar Allan Poe Festival and Awards in October 2024 in Baltimore, Maryland. She's currently at work on her 4th book of Civil War poetry and continues to write and research a biography of Asia Booth Clark, the sister of John Wilkes Booth. And as I said, you can see some of her work at Emerging Civil War. Lisa, thanks for spending some time with us tonight. I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, Emerging Civil War, for hosting me this evening and for everybody joining in. The nameless and faceless of the Civil War. Not everyone who witnessed and experienced the Civil War made it into the history books. So what of all those unknowns? By combining the rhyme and narrative of poetry with Civil War history, a lost voice of the past comes forth to share their experiences and their suffering, a place where the humanity of history and the songs of their soul come together to create a deeper empathy for those lost and unknown. The lines of North and South are blurred in these collections. There are no border states, no governance of politics. For it's my belief that suffering has no boundaries. These poems go beyond the military aspects of the Civil War, beyond the generals, the flanking maneuvers, even beyond, yes, who won and who lost. It rests in the souls of those without a name, without a face. The initial inspiration for the entire collections comes from the diary of a Union soldier named Michael Doherty, who was a prisoner of war. Michael was born in Ireland and came to Bristol, Pennsylvania. He was in Company B, 13th Volunteer Pennsylvania Cavalry, and was captured on many occasions during his time as a soldier, during which he kept a diary. He spent time at Pemberton's, Libby, Belle Island, and eventually at Andersonville Prison in Andersonville, Georgia. It was while he was imprisoned at Andersonville that the horrors of his confinement were brought to light for him and for others, obviously. The deplorable treatment of the Union prisoners in the summer of 1864 was horrific. It was heartbreaking to read of his treatment and the treatment of all the Union soldiers at that time. It was challenging to read his diary, especially his writings from Andersonville. But I believe if he was compelled to write about his experience, and I too felt compelled to bring forth the voices of those who remain nameless and faceless even to this day. An excerpt of Michael's writing during his time in Andersonville said that 100 men a day are dying. It stuck with me that these were numbers, men without a name or a face. And it was his words that brought forth the idea of nameless and faceless of the Civil War, as I thought of all of those who witnessed the Civil War and died and lay buried in thousands upon thousands of graves that only say unknown as their final resting place. I cannot give them a name or a face, but I can give them a voice to tell their stories of compassion, life, death, and grief as a reminder to the world that they did not die in vain. Also, while writing The Nameless and Faceless, the inspiration of the collection from Michael Daugherty and his writings, there was a poetic inspiration from our great American poet, Walt Whitman, which we will hear from him briefly. Andersonville Prison, it began as a stockade built about 18 months before the end of the Civil War in Andersonville, Georgia. It was about 14 months in existence. And at that time, some 45,000 Union prisoners arrived there. Of those, 12,920 died and were buried. It was to those conditions that Michael arrived at Andersonville in February of 1864. As I had mentioned, there was a poetic inspiration along with Michael's writings, and that came from Walt Whitman, and I'll be brief on this point. In December of 1862, our great American poet Walt Whitman, he traveled to Chatham Manor, the Union headquarters in Fredericksburg, Virginia, looking for his brother George when he heard he was wounded in the battle. He did find his brother at a Union hospital in Falmouth, but his wounds were minor. But the experience of Chatham Manor and the treatment of the wounded and dying men affected Walt Whitman so that he stayed for a time writing letters and reciting his poems and nursing soldiers as best he could. From his experiences, he wrote some of his most poignant poems, like the following. The Million Dead, 1865. Here he captures the essence of those nameless and faceless of the Civil War. The dead, the dead, the dead, our dead, for South or North, ours all, our young men, once so handsome and so joyous, taken from us, the son from the mother, the husband from the wife, the dear friend from the dear friend. And everywhere among these countless graves, we see, and ages yet may see, on monuments and gravestones, singly or in masses, the thousands or tens of thousands, the significant word, unknown. Also, an author writes from the heart. However, the poet writes from the soul. And so we begin. The first poem that I will present to you this evening is from my new Nameless and Faceless collection. This poem was inspired by the events on the eve of the Battle of Stones River, December 31st, 1862 to January 2nd, 1863 in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. This was in the Western Theater of the Civil War. Samuel Say of the 1st Tennessee Infantry described what happened as darkness fell. This is December 30th. Just before tattoo, the military bands on each side began their evening music. The still winter night carried their strains to a great distance. At every pause on our side, far away could be heard the military bands of the other, Finally, one of them struck up Home Sweet Home. As if by common consent, all other airs ceased, and the bands of both armies, as far as the ear could reach, joined in the refrain. Who knows how many hearts were bold next day by reason of that air? And based on that evening, it inspired this next poem called Home Sweet Home. I remember it so clearly in my mind's eye and recollect it so. The night of December 30th, 1862, and what happened long ago. It was a time of the Civil War that brought us to this space. Stones River, Murfreesboro, Tennessee, was the name of this terrible place. Both the Army of the Cumberland and the Army of Tennessee were brought to fight. A 3 days battle into the new year and what happened on that night. And here is the story of that late December eve, a night frozen in bitter cold, when voices were raised in togetherness and humanity took hold. I was a member of the Union band that bivouacked with the Cumberland, you see. We played for our soldiers before the battles and even in between. Yet as we played our most patriotic of tunes, there was a commotion from across the way. We could hear the Confederates bivouacked on the riverbank, and they began to play. And so this battling of music drifted across the river bend, and each side did its best to try to outdo one another in this game and music fest. And then there came a lull in the music that hung sadly in the air. It was suddenly quiet, and at that moment it almost felt like despair. It was if as in unison, although perhaps not so exact, the chords began to slowly rise. The soulful tune of Home Sweet Home filled the thoughts of those too sad and lonely to cry. And it was what happened next as I raised my violin to join this moment in time. Both sides began to play, and then in unison, the voices began to chime. To thee I'll return, overburdened with care. The heart's dearest solace will smile on me there. No more from that cottage again will I roam. Be it ever so humble, there's no place like home. Then as quietly as the song began, it faded into the frozen night air. The voices of 81,000 men had said their prayer. Yet I could not but wonder of the multitude of men and the 24,000 casualties they would eventually lend. For some on that very cold December eve, the song Home Sweet Home would be their last, of dreams of home and hearth and love, dreams that would never come to pass. This next poem is from my new collection again, and it's a story of two friends from Boston, Massachusetts. I'm from Boston, so I put this in. The narrator and his friend Daniel, having joined the Union Army, telling the story of the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, Virginia in May of 1864. This was part of General Ulysses S. Grant's overland campaign. Several regiments from Massachusetts were at the battle, and some of those were the 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery, 22nd Massachusetts Infantry, 19th Regiment Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. It's been said that the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse was one of the most vicious and desperate for both the Union and the Confederate forces, especially in the area known as the Mule Shoe. Some 31,000 casualties would result from this battle. So here, a voice of unknown Massachusetts soldiers comes to life to tell us the story of him and his friend Daniel and what happened during that terrible time. The poem is called Me and Daniel. It was through hill, dale, muck, and mire, We marched side by side, me and my friend Daniel, my solace and my pride. We joined in this Civil War together to fight for the Union to free those who had no rights. From Massachusetts we hailed and had never seen such sights, dogwood trees, magnolia, and fields of such delight. But the beauty of what we saw soon faded as the battle lines formed, as the overland campaign began in the spring of '64 into the hail and storm. I turned to my friend Daniel as we marched to a strange sounding place. Spotsylvania Courthouse it was called, as the fear etched across my face. I asked Daniel to stitch my name inside my uniform sleeve, and I did the same for him. Just in case one of us should fall, our identity was safe therein. That night, as we bivouacked by the fire, we began to reminisce of friendships born from a Boston boyhood, Back Bay and joy and bliss. I promised Daniel and he promised me that we would fight as thick as thieves, never leave one another no matter the horror in sight that could cause us to grieve. The lines then formed, the fife, the drum roared, the artillery barrage began. Then shots and shells surrounded us and the death screams from every man. I lost sight of Daniel in the haze of fire and smoke, then panicked as I tried to see. I was relieved then as I saw him leaning against a tree. Daniel, I cried, let's go, we must move on. Yet I saw he did not react. I grabbed him by the hand to roust him to his feet. It was then I noticed he was attacked. A comrade then came by to urge me to go on. Yet as I stood up, I quickly fell. Shot through the chest, he then let me go, and I crawled to my Daniel in farewell. As I felt the life drain from my side, I reached for his hand to grasp. Two friends from Boston who died together, forever and ever, at last. This next poem is from The Nameless and Faceless of the Civil War, Gettysburg, Manassas, and more. It's about Sarah Broadhead. We hear from an unknown Confederate soldier who's dying in the basement of the Lutheran Seminary after the Battle of Gettysburg. The dying soldier in his last moments sees the basement door open and raises his hand to bring attention to his plight. The woman's name and the inspiration for the poem is Sarah Broadhead. She would write of her experiences prior, during, in the aftermath of the battle from her book, Diary of a Lady of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, from June 15th to July 15th, 1863. She went and she cooked and tended and comforted the dying. But it was an entry that I read on July 8th, 1863 that was so extraordinary that while working and tending to the wounded, which had been converted at the Lutheran Seminary, which had been converted into a hospital, she opened the door to the basement and described as such. She says, quote, I found I had only seen the lighter cases, and worse horrors met my eyes on descending the basement of that building. Men wounded in 3 and 4 cases, not able to help themselves least bit, lay almost swimming in the water. I hunted up a lady whom I had been helping and told her, come and see how they were situated. When we came down, she reverently exclaimed, my God, they must all be gotten out of this or they will drown. And so they did, and they helped about 100 soldiers out of the water in that basement. And actually, I was actually able to go into the basement of the Seminary Ridge. And although certainly that basement has changed some over the course of the years, I was actually able to feel the walls of that basement. It was very moving. On July 4th, 1863, of course, a heavy rain swept through Gettysburg, inundating and flooding the basement, where countless soldiers who were too injured had to be moved. And here is the voice of this one unknown Confederate soldier. The name of the poem, Basement. It was so frightfully hot on those early July days. Gettysburg was the name. Oh, the fighting raged. The fife, the drum, the cannon roar, marching in fours in our corps. The sound of fire, the battle din, our color bearer, our day to win. The artillery that I did see and feel, that bended my knee and made me kneel. Yet I prayed, where are you, God on high, the creator, the one of love? So how I cried. I fired my musket and stood my ground. I had no choice with those people all around. For although I defended my home, my wife, my children there and all my life, I tried to take cover, you see, up by the seminary it was to be. But the mini ball that struck me down leveled me right to the ground. I fell, and all I could see, the soldiers fighting all around me. Then it became quiet from the fire, and the sound of the wounded, it was so dire. I could not speak, I could barely breathe. I crawled to find cover anywhere you see. A day or two went by, I am not sure. I found myself on a basement floor, but I was not alone. I barely had room for the piles of soldiers in all this gloom. The moans and the bloodshed that echoed within became even louder as the rains began. And soon our haven filled. These souls you see began to drown in the filth and debris. My breath was fading, my wounds too great, when the basement door opened and I saw her face. With my last ounce of strength, I reached out my arm. I cried out, help me, take me from harm. There were so many of us in that basement, you see, too many wounded with no one to plead. Then pain that had drained the life from me began to ebb and set me free. The woman came towards me, yet I began to fade from her sight. I was leaving this place to the Almighty's might. There were no more sounds of cries and such. The white light came for me, and I felt his touch. And as I began to ascend from this death place, my comrades were with me, blessed by his grace. This next poem from my new collection again. It was inspired by all the soldiers, both North and South, who wrote letters to their wives or sweethearts. There's one particular letter, obviously, that caught my attention, and I'm sure you know it. It was written by Union Major Sullivan Ballou in the days before the first battle, Manassas or Bull Run, in July of 1861. His eloquence in describing his love for his wife Sarah remains for me one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking letters of the Civil War, especially when he says, quote, Sarah, my love for you is deathless. It seems to bind me to you with mighty cables that nothing but omnipotence could break. But, oh Sarah, if the dead can come back to this earth and flit unseen around those they love, I shall always be near you in the garish day and the darkest night, amidst your happiest scenes and gloomiest hours, always, always. And if the soft breeze fans your cheek, it shall be my breath, or the cool air cools your throbbing temples, it shall be my spirit passing by. Major Sullivan Ballou was mortally wounded during the battle on July 21st, 1861, and he would die from his wounds on July 29, 1861. Now, in this particular poem that I'm going to read, called Like Helen of Troy, we don't know who's speaking, Union or Confederate, but it speaks to the beauty of love. All soldiers missing their wives and their sweethearts. It's the beauty of love, whether it was they're thinking of how beautiful they are physically, or just the beauty of love from the heart that surpasses everything. And in thinking of Sullivan Ballou and his beautiful words, and thinking of all those soldiers writing letters and thinking of the ones at home, the thought of this particular poem came to mind. It's called Like Helen of Troy. As I sat here to write in my tent, my pencil frozen cold, 'tis you I think of, my darling, thine hair like rivers of gold, and beauty like that of Helen of Troy, and Cleopatra of Egypt too. None can compare to you, my darling, so how is this so true? Ah, the sound of cannon fire will soon interrupt my loving script to you. Yet I would give it all up to kiss your lips and there again say adieu. There's nothing more in this world I want than to have this civil war cease, and you and I together forever in our country new with peace. 'Tis time now I must go. This letter to you I hold near, for into the march and fire and fray God help me in my fear. It was near Marie's Heights in Fredericksburg that it rained like freezing fire. The cannon assailed down from all ends. It was then I knew it was so dire. Added to the shot and shell and the screams of the wounded, I say, I realized I was down and dying in the fray. I reached into my pocket and kissed your letter with all my heart. God, no, please, it is not time to part. I thought I heard you calling to me, your beauty that shone so bright. But I realized it was the light of God taking me from this plight. Farewell, my love, my Helen, my Cleopatra. None can compare with thee. But like the ancient beauties of this world, it was never meant to be. This next poem is from the Nameless and Faceless Women of the Civil War. It's the story of the Klingel House in Gettysburg. I was inspired by this poem. I was able actually to stand on the front porch of the Klingel House, obviously before it's had some problems. And hopefully they'll be able to save it. But this was several years ago, and I stood on the front porch. And it was at sunset. And you could actually see the beautiful sunset reflected in the windows of the Klingel House. I was so moved by that singular beauty. And of course, thinking of what had happened there. And so I was inspired by the events and by standing on that porch. This is kind of what came to me. The story of the Klingel house, it was purchased by Daniel Klingel in April of 1863. His profession was a farmer, shoemaker, but little did he realize in just a short time that his house would be in the middle of the Battle of Gettysburg on July 2nd and 3rd. And the family was warned on July 2nd by the Union forces to leave their home. They vacated. And when they returned to the house on July 4th, they returned to their home in a devastating scene. Bullet holes riddled the house, powder marks charred the walls, and from inside the house where soldiers had taken refuge to continue the fight, crops were destroyed and their fences, the whole property. But it was said that the farm was covered and littered by the dead. Bodies lay all around the house. 2 were just inside the gate. 2 others were under the porch where I stood, where they must have crawled for shelter before dying of their wounds. 1 shattered tree in the Klingel orchard concealed 4 dead soldiers huddled around a cooking pan with food still in it. And it was while I was standing there thinking of that the poem The Klingle House came to be. My eyes could barely see for the tears that stung my sight of the news my son Ethan had ascended to the Almighty's light. The letter I held in my hand from your commander I see, to tell me of your bravery so that others could be free. In early July of 1863, upon the battlefield of our North, Gettysburg 'tis the name, so how you did go forth. The 3 days of such fighting, the slaughter I cannot grasp. So many gone like you, my son, I fear I shall collapse. But as I read the letter and heard of how you died, it is as if I can see you, my son, and be there at your side. So now I will take my breath and read the part of your pain, and left this earth a better man, of this I shall refrain. 'Twas on July the 4th, the holiday of our nation's birth, they found your body, my son. With your comrade next to you, God's will you see was done. It says here you were wounded and tried to take shelter, I see, to the Klingle farm under the porch, yet it was not meant to be. The owner came and found his farm littered with the dead of 3 days of the din of battle where our nation bled. I see you, my son, under that porch as you tried to save your life. Yet God had other plans for you and took you from that strife. There's no more to say just now. The letter, it ends with thanks for the sacrifice of so many, my Ethan in the ranks. It's a palpable sadness as I stood there on that porch, and the voice of an unknown mother, one of those soldiers who tried to save himself and yet ended up dying under the Klingle porch. This next poem is from The Nameless and Faceless Women of the Civil War. The unknown woman in this poem, the name of the poem is called My Henry. And she has heard that President Abraham Lincoln is coming to Gettysburg on November 19, 1863, to dedicate the new National Cemetery for the Union Civil War dead. Now, the battle was just a few months before, and this woman's husband, Henry, was one of the thousands who died during the battle. She's still suffering at that loss, of course. Yet she resolves to come to the cemetery to hear President Lincoln. But the crowd is too much for her to get through. But in an instant, President Lincoln raises his head and their eyes meet. And in that instance, she foresees his death in his eyes. And he too knows of his fate. It binds them together for this one moment in time. I just want to add a little bit more about the look in President Lincoln's eyes. And it was a description of that look by, again, the great American poet Walt Whitman that inspired this poem. Now, when he came to Washington, D.C. during the Civil War, and again, he spent time visiting soldiers, writing to them, reciting his poetry. But he says, quote, I see very plainly Abraham Lincoln's dark brown face with the deep cut lines and eyes, and always to me with a deep latent sadness in the expression. We've got so that we've always exchanged bows, and very cordial ones. He bowed and smiled, but far beneath his smile I noticed well the expression I have alluded to. None of the artists or pictures have caught the deep though subtle and indirect expression of this man's face. There's something else there. One of the great portrait painters, or 2 or 3 centuries ago, is needed. And if you look, and I know you've all seen, photos of President Lincoln, but especially that last photograph that was taken in 1865. And if you look at his eyes, you can see the agony and the suffering in his eyes. And from that, the poem, My Henry. I walked past the patch of earth that housed my Henry, now gone. Silence forever from my sight, God help me, I am so forlorn. Is Gettysburg, I tell you now, whose battle he so valiantly did fight, for our Union he did say, I still love him with all my might. 'Tis November now, 5 months has passed since then. So now our president is here to dedicate our fallen men. And so I heard his words quite beautifully, I do say. Like poetry from God above, I bowed my head to pray. It took him just 2 minutes or so as the words flowed ever so divine. Like manna from heaven that touched the soul, I know that they did mine. Yet as much as I tried to be near him, the crowd in between too great, I wanted to tell our president of my Henry's fate. I had to try to reach him, to tell him of my heart. It was the look in his eyes that have haunted me, careworn, that gave me a start. For in those eyes, it seemed to me, he too knew of his fate and would come to rest, I am sure, in the glory of heaven's gate. This next poem, from the Nameless and the Faceless of the Civil War, Richmond, Virginia, April 4th, 1865. On April 4th, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln visited the Confederate capital of Richmond. It was only 1 day after Union forces had captured the city. Accompanied by a small group of soldiers and growing entourage of freed slaves, he walked to the Confederate White House and sat in President Jefferson Davis's chair. In this poem, the narrator is one of the freed black slaves of the South who watches as Lincoln walks through the burned Confederate capital of Richmond. And he follows the band of former slaves and soldiers and follows the president as he walks through the city. The narrator witnesses a former slave who's an elderly man as he stops and kneels before Lincoln. A poignant fact of history is well noted as the ever humble Lincoln reminds the elderly man. He says, kneel to God only and thank him for the liberty you will hereafter enjoy. Quote, many watched as their eyes met in the understanding of equality. Then Lincoln took the hand of his youngest son, Tad, and continued through the city. Tragically, several days later, on April 14, 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated as he watched a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The name of this poem is called No More on Bended Knee. Such was the date, April 4th, 1865, the day I knew I was truly alive. For what my eyes beheld that day, the sight of the emancipator coming my way. It was for him and for those who fought to stop the taskmaster and all who wrought. The scourge of slavery is no more. I see him walking, I must know more. As he made his way through the town, remnants of the city burned to the ground. The ones who are now free that follow his gate through the city that held such hate. And so I caught up with all of those whose freedom now it was to behold, and watched and listened as they cried out to him, the freedom from the lash. Ah, such a sin. I walked towards the multitudes that gather around to hail the emancipator with a crown. But wait, then what did I see coming through the crowd behind me? An elderly man whose back was bent from torturous years of a slave spent. And as he knelt on his knee to bow to the one who set him free, I heard the whisper, ever so fine, from the man believed so divine. Kneel to God only, I heard him say, and thank him for the liberty that has come your way. And with that, he held out his hand to help up the grateful elderly man and looked him square into the face of now equals in this human race, and reached for the hand of his little son. I could only think then, we are now as one. This next poem that I'm going to read comes from The Nameless and Faceless of the Civil War, Gettysburg, Manassas, and more. And I'm including this particular poem because it was the inspiration for the poem I wrote called Rise Up All Ye of Manassas Rise. This I wrote during my residency when I lived on the battlefield of Manassas. What an incredible experience that was. Every day I would get up and actually walk onto the battlefield and think, and then come back and write. It was an incredibly moving experience, one that has stayed with me, and I'm so grateful to have had it. But it was in the fall of 2021, and I was on my usual walk. I used to love walk the first battle trail, and I came to the part of the trail where the Bull Run Creek was on my left. If anyone's walked this trail, was on my left, and the forestry was on my right. It was a beautiful fall afternoon, and I was used to the forest sounds and the animals and birds singing. And at this particular time of day, for some reason, it got very quiet, and I didn't hear any birds singing, and I didn't hear the creek moving. And at that moment, a leaf just fell right in front of me to my foot. And as I bent down to pick up the leaf, and I thought of all the unknowns and the hallowed grounds of all the battlefields, and as I stood there, this poem came to mind, and I actually donated it to the Park Service for Manassas. And this was the inspiration. Rise up, all ye of Manassas, rise, and take your place among the skies. For in the fields among those unknowns, there are stories I know that are yet untold, whispers of valor and elan that you did make, stories of friendships you did not forsake. Rise up, all ye Manassas, rise, and take your place along God's side. The lush fields colored in magnificent green were once killing fields of the obscene, a battlefield where the country divided and fought, and now where unity shall forever be taught. Rise up, all ye Manassas, rise. I have heard your silent cries, whispers of those left behind without a name or a face. So many I know here in this place, names like the deep-cut, unfinished railroad to witness here and there, and the stone house, Henry Hill, filled with such despair. With each step across these hallowed grounds, Be mindful a soldier may have found a final resting place too young, excuse me, a final resting place too young to die, yet so many did, is how I cry. Rise up, all ye Manassas, rise. Your presence here is so defined. Just walk the stone bridge along the riverbed, the one called Bull Run that long ago bled. Stop and listen to the forest sounds, and for a moment become one with them, for their sacrifice in so many men. Rise up, all ye Manassas, rise. Take thy brethren by your side, and hand in hand for those who ascended to the Almighty's throne. Let us never forget those lost and unknown. This last poem that I'm going to read this evening is again from my new collection, my new Nameless and Faceless collection. It's called Under the Dogwood Tree. And I want to preface this by letting you all know that a original musical score has been created for Under the Dogwood Tree by Ryan Masalik and the Marching Still Ensemble. You can find that actual work on my website, and Ryan performed it last year in Gettysburg during the Winter Lecture Series. I was completely moved. It's very beautiful. So if you have a chance to check it out, please do. It's a beautiful piece of work. Now, this particular poem, again, Under the Dogwood Tree, it's about two friends, soldiers, fighting together during the Battle of the Wilderness, Virginia, again in early May 1864, part of General Ulysses S. Grant's overland campaign. And again, in this instance, neither North or South is identified. This poem was inspired by Drew Gilpin Faust's book, The Republic of Suffering, and the PBS documentary, Death and the Civil War. Now, we know there were instances during the war where a soldier would write to a fallen soldier's family and try to describe or identify where they had buried them. Sometimes they would just bury them on the battlefield and move on. Perhaps they tried to carve their name on a rough piece of board. And in this instance, place a small map with directions as to how and where to find them. And if you watch the PBS documentary, you will actually see an instance of that. And it was that, and the description of the event, that inspired me to write this poem. So it's to imagine then a soldier drawing a small diagram, perhaps with the name of the town, accompanied, here is the tree, the church, so many paces from a stream. And this is to direct the loved ones at home where to find their soldier. And to imagine as well those, again, who were never located and still remain nameless and faceless. This is called Under the Dogwood Tree. I take my pencil to tell you now of how your son died that day upon the battle of the wilderness. Please read on as I say. It was a time of day called twilight. Of this I do believe, that we marched and I saw him fall. So how I do now grieve. I dropped my musket amidst the shot and fire. I knelt beside him. I knew then it was so dire. But I was ordered double quick to my feet and hurried on my way. Yet I knew I would come back to find him somewhere in the fray. Later I asked to search to find him in between the lines of dread. But I was denied and had to wait and watched as the river ran red. Then next I was ordered into the field where our soldiers lay without breath, as the grim reaper gathered his harvest in anticipation of so much death. And as I began to dig to bury your son, I knew I had to do more. I snipped a locket of his bright blonde hair and send to you to adore. Also, you will find a map of where I laid him to rest. I drew it as best I could to guide you in your quest. And as the pink petals of the dogwood tree rained down upon my face, I knew I could not leave him there without a name, without a face. I pray then you will find your soldier son. Of this I do decree. Look for him there, if you can, under the dogwood tree. I want to leave you with this. I hope my poems have inspired you to remember those who rest in our Civil War cemeteries, who lie buried without a name or a face. And perhaps stop for just a moment at the stone that reads unknown and think of that soldier. For in that moment of remembrance, in that singular moment, they are truly not forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It was a fantastic 50 minutes of Civil War poetry and quite some poignant things to think about there. If folks have any questions or comments they'd like to share with Lisa, we have a couple minutes here. We do have one question for you in the chat, and I know you'll be glad to answer this one. Will Lisa be in Gettysburg this coming week, and will she have any speaking opportunities?
Well, yes, I'm very excited to share with you that I will be at the Seminary Ridge Museum, and I'll be presenting The Nameless and Faceless of the Civil War on Wednesday, July 1st at 12:30. So I'm hoping anybody out there who's coming to Gettysburg can come and hear me present live. So that would be great.
Wonderful. And we'll give a shout out. The Seminary Ridge Museum and the Adams County Historical Society both have a full slate of events. So check out both of their websites if you're looking for some of the other activities going on, including Lisa's presentation. And, being anniversary weekend, the Park Service has a lot going on. The Gettysburg Heritage Center has a lot going on. So plenty to see, but take some time and check out Lisa's talk on July 1st. A former ranger at Antietam, at Manassas, says it was great. Manassas 5 years ago went by fast. So,
oh, wow. I think I know who it is.
And then just lots of Lisa's poetry is amazing. Hi from Alexandria, and really appreciate Lisa's poems. I believe them to be well researched and historically accurate. Truly gives a voice to the unknown, both north and south. Very powerful, very beautiful and poignant. So quite a bit of fan mail in the chat there.
Well, I appreciate that, Chris, and it's a little unusual to combine literature with Civil War history, but the history stays the same. But it's the human aspect of it that we're exploring, and it's bringing art to portions of the Civil War history. Little again, a little bit of a different take, and I'm really, really grateful that you've taken the time, and Emerging Civil War has embraced my work. It's greatly appreciated because I love doing it, and I just believe that no soldier, no one from the Civil War should have died in vain and died unknown.
Yeah. So let me ask you briefly here, since we have a couple minutes. So you've done residencies at 3 different parks. Tell us a little bit about what those experiences have been like for you.
Well, I'd love to. The first residency for Gettysburg in 2020, unfortunately, a month before I was ready to go, I couldn't go because of COVID. So I was ready. There's a lot going on with that. My second residency in Manassas, Virginia, was extraordinary. I was housed literally steps away from the battlefield. And to have that opportunity to wake up every day, and I know all the people who love our Civil War battlefields, they're all hallowed ground, every portion of them, not just the cemeteries, but to have that opportunity to go out and walk and just think in the quiet, in the serene portion of this beautiful, beautiful green fields, and to know what happened there, and to take what happened there. And I would go back to my house or my room, and I would think about a particular event, from obviously it was, first and second Manassas, and then think about a particular situation, and then put a poetic voice to it. So it was extraordinary. And there isn't a moment that whenever I'm in Northern Virginia, no matter what, I have to stop in Manassas and visit. Particular site for me is the Stone House. I absolutely love the Stone House. Just like when I go to Gettysburg, my favorite place is the Klingel House. It's the first place I go to, even though I know you're right, it's in disrepair right now. So, and the interesting thing on my third residency, Stones River, Murfreesboro, Tennessee. I was just there a couple of weeks ago. But as far as my residency was concerned, you're going to love this one. A week before I was getting ready to get on the plane, they had some Doge cuts, and I was unable to. I was unable to go a week before. But it did not stop me from being able to get there this year and stand in the slaughter pen. And it was just incredible. And that poem that I wrote, Home Sweet Home, that was part of my narrative for my application. And I believe it helped me to win the residency. And I'm hoping one day that these residencies will open up again. They're extremely limited now, that they will open up again. And Stones River has communicated with me. I'd be the first one to call back. So they really there. I know. Talk about being snake bit, right? I win three.
Right. Wow. So as a poet, is there a poet that you draw on for inspiration or guidance, or someone that you would recommend people look at?
I tell you what, you heard me reference several times Walt Whitman, and it was he wrote Leaves of Grass and his Oh Captain, about President Lincoln. I would try, if somebody's interested, to look up his works, because and he's talked about seeing President Lincoln's eye, that latent expression. His eyes, he focused on his eyes. And when he wrote about that latent expression, that brought forth the poem. So, I would definitely say Walt Whitman. There was also Longfellow's poem, Christmas Bells.
Mm-hmm.
That was an extraordinary poem. Obviously, his wife had died. She was burned to death in an accident. His son enlisted in the Civil War, and there was all that friction. But it took him time to come through that, and then he wrote that beautiful poem, Christmas Bells, that one. So those are some of the ones I would recommend, and also to a lot of Civil War diaries. A lot of my inspiration obviously come from firsthand accounts, so that's very important. But a lot of the diaries that I have read specifically from women. There's, Kate Cummings, Cornelia Hancock, even Julia Jackson, Cornelia Peake McDonald. That was an interesting one, from Winchester, Virginia, and even Myrta Lockett Avery. She wrote A Virginia Girl in the Civil War, but she wrote that on behalf of a Confederate widow's officer. And she wrote that. So there was a lot that I read in there that inspired more poems that were in the collection. So the Civil War diaries, obviously, I go to. And if there's an instance where I'm finding that they're talking about someone and it's an unknown person, obviously, that I will extract a poem from and create something for that.
Very good. And if people want to continue to follow your work and to get copies of your books, remind us of your website.
It's lisasamia.com. I'm also on TikTok and IG. I'm kind of all over the social media, so you can find me there. And all my books are on my website, Barnes & Noble, all retailers. So, yep.
Fantastic. Well, Lisa, I want to say thanks again for spending some time with us today. And
Thank
I
you.
also want to give a shout out to our great friend, Darren Rollins, our social media manager, who's behind the scenes making things happen today because of his tech magic. And this is no small thing because Darren is from England and the World Cup is going on and soccer is a religion for Darren and his fellow countrymen. So he's taking some time out to do some poetry with us tonight, too. Lisa, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure. Hope to see you again.
Thank you. I'm Chris Mackowski for Emerging Civil War. Thank you so much for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.